Welcome to the deep dive. We're going deep today. A pretty crucial question, I'd say.
Yeah.
How do we, best keep tabs on progress when it comes to global water, sanitation, hygiene, all that,
Oh, yeah.
wash ash, especially looking ahead past 2030? What's next? Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you need to get a grasp on this whole, complex area, and you don't want to get totally lost in the weeds. So we've pulled out like the core nuggets from a really dense background paper, the latest GLAA's 2024 country survey.
Mhm.
That's the UN's global analysis and assessment of sanitation and drinking water.
Right.
And of course, the global water policy reports, UN docs, all the sustainable development stuff. So we're covering a lot of ground here.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds like it. So what's the mission? What's the big takeaway from this whole deep dive?
Well, I think our goal here is to really cut through the clutter. The current wash monitoring situation is, frankly, a bit of a mess. So we're going to try to pinpoint the real challenges, the things that are actually holding us back, and then explore some new approaches, ways to measure progress that are, more aligned, more effective. Basically, think of this as your express lane to understanding where global wash is headed.
Okay, I like it. Express lane. Efficient, right?
Yeah.
So let's dive in. Where do we even start with all of this?
Well, I think to really grasp where we are with global wash monitoring, you have to start with the sheer number of frameworks out there. It's mind-boggling. We've got 72 different global and regional frameworks.
Whoa, 72.
72, plus another 10 that are country-specific that we dug into. So yeah, it's a lot.
That's a lot to keep track of. I mean, that sounds incredibly complicated, to be honest.
It is. More than just complicated, it's a problem. Because, all this fragmentation means we're duplicating efforts, we can't really compare progress across different regions, and we end up with this fuzzy, disjointed picture of what's working globally.
It's like everyone's speaking a different language almost.
Yeah, kind of. And it's not just the frameworks. This lack of unity goes down to the actual indicators they're using to measure progress. Out of those 72 frameworks, 60 of them have their own unique sets of indicators.
So different ways of measuring the same thing.
Yeah, different ways of measuring the same thing. And they're using a mix of, quantitative data, numbers, hard stats, qualitative data, more descriptive stuff about experiences and perceptions, and often a combination of both. It's a real mixed bag.
Hold on. Are they even getting all this data? I mean, 72 frameworks, different indicators. It's a lot of data collection, right?
Right. And here's another piece of the puzzle. A lot of these frameworks rely on what we call primary data collection. So they're going out and gathering new info through surveys, workshops, interviews. It's a lot of legwork.
I bet.
Only a tiny fraction, only 11 of those 72 frameworks are actually tapping into routine monitoring systems that countries already have in place.
That does sound like a lot of duplicated effort. So I have to ask, are these monitoring frameworks even connected to the processes where countries, actually review their wash progress?
Good question. And honestly, the connection is weak. Only about 20% of the frameworks we looked at had a strong tie-in to those review processes.
So are we basically just collecting data for the sake of collecting data? Is there any common ground at all?
Well, there is some good news. When you look at the country-level frameworks, they do tend to align pretty closely with the UN's 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goal 6.
Right, which is all about water and sanitation.
Right. Exactly. And we also see disalignment with regional agendas like the African Union's Agenda 2063. So at least there's some consensus on the big picture, on the overall goals.
Okay, that's somewhat reassuring. So speaking of big picture goals, you mentioned this idea of a wash results chain. What's that all about?
Okay, so imagine it like a chain reaction, a logical sequence of how wash improvements actually happen.
Okay.
So first, you've got your inputs, the resources, the enabling conditions you need to get started.
Right.
Then you get your outputs. These are the activities, the services that are actually delivered. Then come the outcomes. These are the more immediate changes, the results you see because of those outputs.
Okay.
And finally, the impacts, the broader long-term effects on public health, economic development, stuff like that.
So it's not just about building a well, for example. It's about tracking the whole process, right?
Exactly. We need to track indicators across this whole chain, from inputs to impacts, to really get a sense of how things are working or not working. We track inputs to see if we're putting the right resources in, outputs to see if we're actually delivering services, outcomes to see the immediate changes in people's lives, and impacts to measure those long-term benefits. And by looking at the whole chain, we can pinpoint bottlenecks, areas for improvement at each stage.
Okay, I'm following you. So where are we at with tracking these indicators?
Well, it varies a lot. Governance general, for example, was considered an input in 14 frameworks, while service level and quality, like how reliable and accessible services are, that was an output in 26. And for outcomes, national OES coverage estimates were tracked in 33 frameworks.
So some parts of the chain are definitely getting more attention than others, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And the research gives us some really specific examples of what countries are actually tracking. For inputs, we see things like whether a legal framework's been, properly enacted, that's a governance input, or the number of workers per, say, 1,000 connections, looking at human resources. For infrastructure, they might track something like the construction of a big regional water supply system as planned. And for regulation, there's stuff like, percentage of services that are actually meeting regulatory standards.
So those are inputs. What about the outputs? What are we measuring there?
Outputs, you've got things like the percentage of drinking water quality tests that are actually meeting the standards. That's under surveillance. For community participation, they might track how well they respond to customer complaints. Like, are they actually fixing problems when people report them? Wastewater management, you've got indicators like, SDG 6.3.1. That's the proportion of wastewater that's treated safely. And then affordability, obviously huge. They're looking at things like, are water prices actually affordable for, say, rural residents? And of course, environmental impact. Are they reducing adverse impacts on the environment?
Okay, so we're measuring inputs, outputs, now we're at outcomes. Well, what kind of progress are they looking at there?
For outcomes, a big one is the proportion of the population that's actually using safely managed drinking water. That's like service delivery, front and center. Affordability, again, a big one. How many people can actually afford wash services without breaking the bank? And then the broader economic impacts, stuff like the percentage of GDP that wash contributes to.
Okay, so it sounds like we're measuring a lot, but are we actually getting a clear picture of what's working and what's not? I mean, are we just drowning in data?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the answer is, it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's a lot of variation in how well countries are actually tracking these indicators against their own baselines. Things like service coverage, delivery, quality, infrastructure, those tend to have higher tracking rates. But when it comes to governance, human resources, equity, economic impacts, those rates are way lower. And those are arguably some of the most crucial areas, the things that could really be driving success or failure. So, yeah, it's a bit like flying blind in some ways.
Wow, that's a little concerning. Okay, so we've got a fragmented monitoring landscape, but now there's this buzz about wash systems approaches. What does that even mean?
Right. So there's this growing realization that just, building wells and toilets isn't enough. We need to think bigger. We need to think about systems. So the wash systems approach, it's about looking at all the interconnected pieces that are needed for like sustained delivery of safe and managed wash services. It's about functionality, resilience, the overall strength of these systems.
Okay, so it's not just about the hardware, it's about how everything fits together. Makes sense. But is there evidence that this systems approach actually works?
The evidence base is still kind of, taking shape. But there was this really interesting systematic review by Valcourt and a few others back in 2020. They dug through a ton of studies on WASH systems to see what factors were being studied, what impacts were being reported.
And what did they find?
Well, they found that, financial, technical, institutional, social, environmental factors, those were the big ones. Also, a lot of the studies were really focused on rural areas and communities, not so much on urban or national level systems. And a lot of them were case studies, which are great, but they don't always tell you the whole story.
So lots of individual examples, but maybe not a big picture understanding.
Right. And here's a big one. Only a tiny percentage of these studies actually reported on the direct impact on WASH services. Did they actually improve? So we need more research that directly links these systems approaches to better service delivery, better public health outcomes.
That seems like a pretty big gap in our understanding.
It is. And the review actually pointed out 5 key knowledge gaps that we need to tackle. We need clear definitions of what a WASH system actually is. We need to understand how all the different pieces of the puzzle, all the factors, how they interact and influence each other. We need better governance, financing, accountability mechanisms, and better ways to monitor and evaluate these systems, like methods that are specifically designed for systems. And lastly, we need to understand the politics, the economics, the context that shapes all of this.
Okay, so lots to figure out. A lot more research needed, it sounds like. Now let's talk about real-world examples. How do countries that are on track to meet their WASH goals, how do they compare to the ones that are, lagging behind?
Yeah, so the GLAS report from 2021-2022, that gave us some good insights. They looked at a bunch of indicators to see where those two groups, the on track and the need to accelerate, where they differ. It's all about finding clues to what drives progress.
So what were some of the key differences?
Well, one big one was national WASH plans, actual plans with resources behind them. The countries that are on track, they're much more likely to have, the money allocated to actually implement their plans, both for urban and rural drinking water services. There's a big gap there between the two groups.
Makes sense. You need resources to make progress. What else?
Another big one is absorption, like how well countries actually use the money that's been committed. The on-track countries are much better at spending their domestic funds across all areas of WASH.
So it's not enough to just have money sitting there.
Yeah.
You need to be able to use it effectively.
Exactly. And then there's the long-term financial health of the services themselves, cost recovery. On-track countries tend to do better there, especially for rural drinking water. So they're able to generate revenue to cover the costs of running the services, which is key for long-term sustainability.
Okay, that makes sense. What about risk management? Any differences there?
Yeah. The on-track countries are much more likely to be proactive about risk. They're doing things like water safety planning, sanitation safety planning, identifying potential problems and trying to head them off before they become disasters.
Always good strategy. What about the people doing the work, the human resources?
Huge difference there. On track, countries have a much better situation when it comes to having enough qualified people to manage drinking water services. For sanitation, the gap is a little smaller, but it's still there, especially in key areas like regulation and policy development. The countries that need to accelerate, they often have critical shortages of skilled personnel.
So having a well-staffed and well-regulated WASH sector is really key.
Absolutely. On track, countries are just much better at implementing those regulatory functions for both urban and rural, both drinking water and sanitation. Effective oversight, enforcement, that's a big part of why they're succeeding.
Okay, so this comparison really highlights some key areas where countries can focus their efforts, right? Now, let's hear from the people on the ground. What are the challenges that national water leaders themselves are facing?
Yeah, this is really important. We can't just come up with global solutions in a vacuum. We have to listen to the people who are actually dealing with these issues day in and day out. So the Global Water Policy reports, they provide a really valuable perspective.
So what are they saying?
Well, in the 2023 report, they highlighted the 4 biggest challenges to good water management. And they were inadequate infrastructure, so that keeps coming up, inadequate and inaccessible data and information, fragmented water institutions, and inadequate laws and regulations. So it's a mix of needing the physical stuff and the right governance and information systems.
Okay, so it's not just about digging wells and building pipes.
Nope. And in the 2021 report, they highlighted similar challenges. Data and information was a big one again. But also conflicts between user groups, a lack of public awareness about water issues, and again, inadequate infrastructure and water being a low priority for the government. And, laws and regulations came up again. So there are some consistent themes here.
It's striking how often data and infrastructure are mentioned. What about SDG 6.1 specifically? Safe and affordable drinking water. What are the big roadblocks there?
When they asked national leaders about that, the number one answer was lack of financing. Not surprising, right? But the second most common concern was governance problems. And for low-income countries, governance was actually a bigger concern than financing. So it's not just about money, it's about having good management, good policies, strong institutions.
Okay, so we need to make sure global initiatives are actually addressing these on-the-ground realities. Now let's shift gears and look ahead. What about WADA-EHH beyond 2030? What are the big trends and challenges coming our way?
Right. We can't just focus on the present. We need to be thinking long term. And there are some big trends out there that are going to have a major impact on the WASH sector. Population growth, for one. The global population is going to keep growing for a while, even though it'll eventually level off. That means more pressure on water resources, more demand for sanitation services.
Right. And more people are moving to cities, right?
Yeah. Urbanization is huge. By 2050, 70% of the world's population is going to be living in urban areas. And a lot of that growth is happening in smaller cities and towns, which can lead to more inequality, more slums if we're not careful. Think about it. We could have 2 billion more people living in slums in the next 30 years. That's going to be a huge challenge for providing basic services.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that number.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got population growth, urbanization. What else?
Pollution. We tend to overlook this one, but it's a big deal. The World Economic Forum, their Global Risk Report 2025, they highlighted pollution, including water pollution, as a major, major threat. We need to be monitoring this better, regulating it better, and investing more in solutions.
Okay, pollution on the radar. And, of course, there's climate change.
Yeah, the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Climate change is already messing with the water cycle big time. We're seeing more water scarcity, more extreme weather events, floods, droughts. It's going to get worse, and we need to be ready for it. We need to develop systems that are resilient, both water and sanitation.
Yeah, climate resilient sanitation.
Yeah.
That's something I don't think people think about enough. So, given all these challenges, all these trends, are there any initiatives or frameworks out there that are trying to tackle this?
Yeah, there are a few key ones. The high-level panel on water, they came up with 5 mission areas, and 2 of them are really relevant here. Mission 3, which is all about creating a circular water economy, where we're actually capturing the value of wastewater. And Mission 5, which aims to make sure that no child dies from unsafe water. Big goal. And then there's the Pact for the Future. That's a new UN agreement that tackles stuff like water scarcity, pollution, the role of science and technology in finding solutions.
Okay, so those are some good starting points.
Yeah. And the Global Sustainable Development Report 2023, that emphasizes how all the SDGs are connected. They talk about 6 entry points for making progress, and the idea is that if we make progress in one area, it can have positive ripple effects on others. So it's all connected.
We can't just silo these issues, right? They all impact each other.
Exactly. And the way we think about the SDGs after 2030, that's evolving too. There's talk about focusing on fewer, more cross-cutting goals and really addressing those links between them.
Makes sense. So it's not just about achieving individual goals, it's about how they all fit together.
Exactly. And we've got initiatives like the Water Action Decade, and then there's the development of indicators under the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Framework, and the financing for development stuff. So lots of moving parts.
It sounds like it. Now, what about the means of implementation for SDG 6? What does that even mean, and how do we track that?
Yeah, so the means of implementation, that's like all the stuff that's needed to actually achieve the goals. The money, the technology, the capacity building, the policies. But monitoring this stuff has been tricky.
I can imagine.
But there are 3 areas they're focusing on for future monitoring. First, tracking financial flows, where the money's going. Second, monitoring those other drivers of progress. Governance, capacity development, innovation, data, human rights, all of that. And third, understanding those interlinkages between the SDGs.
So looking at the bigger picture, not just individual goals.
Right. And it's all about developing good indicators, ones that are relevant, feasible to measure, and actually useful for decision making.
So we're learning from the past and trying to refine how we track these things.
Yeah.
Now, before we get to the Align to Accelerate initiative, let's talk about what we can learn from other sectors. How have they gone about selecting indicators?
Yeah, that's a great point. We don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
Other sectors have been through similar processes, especially public health. Like the WHO, they have their core health indicators. They brought together a bunch of stakeholders to agree on those. And within WASHF, we've seen similar efforts, like developing indicators for the post-2015 SDGs and indicators specifically focused on gender and WASH.
So what are some of the key principles or criteria that have come out of these efforts?
Well, organizations like the OECD, they've developed specific criteria for water governance indicators. And the process for prioritizing gender-specific WASH indicators, that highlighted some important things too, like the indicators need to be relevant, they need to be feasible to measure. And for the SDGs in general, there's a whole set of criteria. They need to be relevant to the target, methodologically sound, measurable using available data, limited in number, and really focused on outcomes, the actual changes we want to see.
Okay, so those are all good lessons to keep in mind. So let's talk about Align to Accelerate. What's the big idea here?
Okay, so Align to Accelerate, or A2A, the goal is to develop a core set of indicators and a common framework for monitoring and reviewing progress, specifically for WASH-OSH systems. The idea is to get everyone on the same page, using the same metrics so we can really see how we're doing in strengthening these systems for the long haul.
Okay, so it's about creating a more unified and effective way of tracking progress. What's the plan for doing that?
So A2A is a 4-phase process. This deep dive we're doing right now, this is part of phase 1, gathering information, doing analysis, laying the groundwork. Then, in phase 2, they're going to develop and agree on that core set of indicators.
Okay.
Phase 3, they'll pilot test those indicators in real-world settings and develop the monitoring and review framework. And then phase 4 is all about scaling up, getting countries to use these tools with support from development partners.
So it's a long-term effort. What have they come up with so far in this first phase?
Yeah, so they've proposed 8 indicator domain families. These are like categories that capture the key dimensions of strong wash systems. They cover stuff like national policy and strategy, institutional arrangements, regulations, service delivery, human resources, infrastructure, public engagement and accountability, financial management, and then what they call frontier issues.
Frontier issues.
Yeah, that's like emerging challenges and innovative approaches in the wash sector. So it's about looking ahead, too.
Okay, 8 families. That sounds pretty comprehensive. And are there any, overarching themes they're considering across all these domains?
Yes, 2 big ones: gender, equity, inclusion, and rights. Making sure wash systems are serving everyone fairly. And resilience and risk. Addressing climate change, other potential disruptions. These are cross-cutting issues that need to be baked into the whole monitoring framework.
Absolutely. So how are they actually going to select the core indicators? What criteria are they using?
They've proposed 10 specific criteria grouped into 3 categories. The first category is what should be monitored. That covers stuff like how useful the data will be for decision-making, whether the indicator really reflects a systems-level perspective, how relevant it is across different contexts, and how easy it is to understand and communicate the results.
Okay, makes sense. What about the other categories?
The second is how it should be monitored. That looks at whether the data is credible, reliable, and feasible to collect and analyze. And the third category is what will enable action. That's about whether the indicator can drive accountability, incentivize progress, and align with existing frameworks and commitments.
Okay, so they're really trying to be thoughtful and strategic about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And the next step is to bring in a technical working group led by the WHO and UNICEF to actually nominate, select, and prioritize those core indicators. They'll use these criteria and a scoring model to do that. So it's a pretty rigorous process.
Sounds like it. Well, this has been a real deep dive into a really complex topic. We've covered a lot of ground. The current monitoring situation, wash systems, how different countries are performing, the challenges on the ground, future trends, and now this Align to Accelerate initiative. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but the bottom line is we need a better way to track progress. We need a framework that's aligned, effective, and actually helps us achieve the goal of sustainable wash for everyone. And A2A, that's a really promising step in the right direction.
So here's a final thought for you for everyone listening. Given everything we've talked about, all the interconnections, all the long-term risks, how do we make sure that we're not just tracking access to water and sanitation today? How do we make sure we're also tracking resilience, sustainability for the long haul? What kind of indicators would capture that? What do you think? It's definitely something worth pondering. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.